Yay! Hello, everybody. This is Alexandra Reynolds. I am your guest host for the evening. Ethan and Katie have gone out of town right now on a family emergency, so I am filling in for Ethan. And as always, this will be a super chill, super fun conversation about what's going on in your lives and what questions you have for me or for the OCD community at large. Anything about OCD and related disorders. And we'll give everyone a few minutes to kind of trickle in. If you like, go ahead and say hi in the chat and tell us where you're from. Hello, Captain Cass, Raleigh, Sonia from New Zealand. That sounds cool. Hola, Paola, ¿cómo estás? From the Bay Area. That sounds amazing. Is it super humid over there? It's humid here on the East Coast. It's awful. I had to pull all my plants from the front of my house over to my porch so they wouldn't die. Hello, Louise. How are you? So for those of you who may not know me from Instagram, I am Alexandra Reynolds. I am an IOCDF advocate. I am Latina, and I live in the United States. I actually live in Atlanta, Georgia. I started with the IOCDF advocacy program, I want to say almost a year now. So I've been, hi from Mexico, hola, hola. So I have been doing a lot behind the scenes with the outreach to the Latinx community. I'm also a part of the LGBTQ special interest group, the Faith and OCD special interest group, and the Trauma and OCD special interest group that we are just now getting started. So lots of fun stuff in the advocacy program. And once again, I am filling in for Ethan tonight. So we are going to have lots of fun, although probably not as much fun as you would have with Ethan. Awesome. Thank you, Skyla. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in. And let's see. I'll just get started. Hey, Krista, how are you? And Krista is one of our fellow advocates as well as a therapist. She is an amazing human. So let's see. If I were Ethan, I would talk about what's going on in my life. So this week has been super wild. As some of you who follow me on Instagram may know, I went to the OCD conference in Denver, and it was a huge exposure for me as I have lots of contamination as well as harm obsessions that kind of overlap and turn into obsessions about bringing home, COVID or some kind of fatal illness and giving it to my son and my husband. And I'm always afraid of the worst case scenario. Hey, Nikki. So I worked my way up through my hierarchy with my therapist and went to the OCD conference in Denver. And it was great. And I had an amazing time. And I met so many amazing people. But the entire time I was there, I was doing compulsions. I had my hand sanitizer and I was constantly sanitizing, and I was doing lots of mental rituals, and I was doing, everything I could to be present in the moment, but it was hard because I was doing compulsions, and it was still a great experience. And then I got home and I was sick. I had COVID, and the worst case scenario in my mind happened because I gave it to my husband and my son. And from there, I had a lapse. I became afraid to leave the house again. I started doing all my rituals again. I started washing my hands, constantly, and isolating things into safety zones in my house and not wanting to go anywhere, and really, really struggling. And I felt that, maybe I was wrong about therapy and ERP, and that I was never going to get better, that maybe I was that exception to the rule, right? And that I wasn't going to get better. And we planned a trip out of town that required me once again to get on an airplane for my husband and son's birthday. And so, against everything that was inside of me, I decided to go on this trip last week. And the funny thing is, I had so much anxiety leading up to it, so much anticipatory anxiety. But once I got to the airport with my husband and son, I was okay. Like, yes, I was a little bit scared. And some of my obsessions were still there. But I was able to enjoy watching my son get on a plane for the first time and to help keep him calm. And I was able to parent through that anxiety and be present with my family. And even the trip itself was enjoyable, which is something that I couldn't have done before because I would have been, ritualizing and in my head the whole time. And coming home, I was okay too. I was a little concerned that we'd get sick on the way back home and that we'd bring it home with us. But at the same time, I knew that the risk was the same as it was last time. Maybe, maybe not. And I was willing to take that risk all over again to live into my values. Did we get sick? Yes. Did we get COVID? No, I have a cold. And so I'm here with a cold, brought to you by generic Dayquil. But I think the lesson that I learned from that is that just because something comes and reinforces sort of our worst fears doesn't mean that we failed. It doesn't mean that ERP hasn't worked. It just means that there was a small chance that it could happen, and I embraced that uncertainty and I moved toward my values. And it doesn't mean that it will happen every single time or again, or that I should continue being afraid of that obsession, whatever it is. So, in fact, I think maybe the risk was even smaller for me this time because I wasn't so busy being in my head and doing rituals. And I was able to be present and alert and safe, but not panicking. And I think that that's an important lesson for me to learn, because I always felt that my rituals kept me safe. But I'm kind of realizing that not only do they not keep me safe, but maybe they make me just a tiny bit less safe, if that makes sense. I don't know. Has anyone experienced something like that? Aw, thanks, Louise. That's super sweet. And let's see. I'm going to take a peek back in the chat. I see some questions already in the chat. You guys came prepared today. Okay. I have been worried that while I'm diagnosed with OCD and generalized anxiety disorder from a no-CD therapist, I was first diagnosed as general anxiety disorder and unspecified OCD from a psych who later said that if she had to say that, I may have OCD. Part of me is worried, though, if there was a miscommunication in my end and I actually have generalized anxiety disorder rather than OCD. Are there additional ways to differentiate the two to make sure I'm getting the right tools? So I would go with what your therapist is telling you at this point. It sounds like you have found someone who specializes in OCD and they are doing a good job and helping you with the right tools. I mean, here's the thing. OCD is the doubting disorder. And it is so hard sometimes when we are diagnosed to A, accept that we have OCD, and B, do the work that we need to do to get better, because OCD will make us doubt our diagnosis. It will make us doubt the work that we're doing. It will make us doubt our therapy and our therapist. And so I can't tell you if you really have OCD or not, unfortunately, because I'm not a professional, and I also don't want to give you reassurance. I think that it's possible that you're in the right place, and hopefully, if you're not, your no CD therapist would be the person to discuss that with. "709 Paola Garcia. I'm still working on accepting that there is no cure for OCD and that the anxiety and thoughts are cyclical. How do you deal with the OCD cycle when the thoughts and anxiety come back in full force?" Yeah, I mean, it's so hard sometimes, I think, accepting that there is no cure. And I think for me personally, I know that some people maybe don't see it this way, but for me personally, it was such an important step in my recovery to really accept and understand that OCD is chronic, that there is no cure, and that treatment and recovery really mean utilizing the skills I learn in therapy every single day. And, some days I'm better about it, and other days OCD sneaks up and punches me in the face. And I think when it gets the best of me and it gets back in the driver's seat, I think that what helps is falling back on my self-compassion, falling back on my values, and reminding myself that it's okay. It's OCD. It is chronic and it is frustrating, but it doesn't make me any less of a person. It doesn't mean I failed. It just means I need to utilize my skills and get back in the driver's seat again and move toward whatever it is that's my values. Sometimes when it gets really hard, I find that I have the biggest breakthroughs afterwards. And so I've learned slowly, it's still hard, but to almost welcome that anxiety and welcome the hard times, because usually the harder something is, the more important it is to me, or the more valuable it is. And I think, leaning back on mindfulness, leaning back on my ACT skills, acceptance and commitment therapy, leaning back on self-compassion is such a big help. Treating myself the way I would a friend, not beating myself up or shaming myself if OCD is in the driver's seat and, I do or say something I feel is irrational. It's hard. Sometimes I still shame myself. Sometimes I still get upset and I feel bad about how OCD kind of got the best of me. But I think it's in those moments, it's even more important to offer myself compassion. I hope that helps. Let's see, 710. How can I tell whether my worry is an OCD problem, fear, or a valid safety problem? Yeah, so this is a question I've actually asked myself. And I think that it's important to understand that we don't have to figure that out, right? Like, we don't really need to figure out whether it's an OCD fear or a safety problem. And in fact, trying to figure it out sometimes is going to send us down the path of rumination and trying to figure out problems that, don't necessarily have a solution. If something is OCD, it seems like it's OCD for me, then I simply treat it as OCD. And if it's not OCD, then that's okay. But I tend to err on the side of, if it sounds like OCD, if it looks like OCD, if I'm questioning whether it's OCD, I'm going to treat it like OCD. And if something is a valid safety problem, then generally I'm going to know. It's not something that I necessarily need to figure out. I have faith in myself to respond in the best way possible, whether something is a valid safety problem or not, if that makes sense. Sometimes you can tell if there's urgency behind your thoughts, right? And you're ruminating on it endlessly for hours. But I honestly find that even trying to figure it out that way sometimes leads me down that path to ruminate. So it's better to just treat thoughts that may be OCD as OCD. (714) I have scrupulosity and harm OCD and borderline personality disorder. I'm a Christian. How to navigate and struggling with my Christian faith, the flesh, or OCD? Yeah, that's a really good question. And I wish we had Katie here to help answer that for you. Katie O'Dunn is an interfaith reverend, and she also heads up the faith and OCD community that we have here at the IOCDF. She's an amazing human being. And I know they have a great website. Skyla, could you please put that link in the chat? That is all about helping people navigate scrupulosity and faith and OCD. I'm not the best person to answer that, although I can say that for me, navigating my own issues with faith and OCD, I tend to move toward what gives me joy. So if I'm doing something like praying or, thinking about going to church, if it's giving me joy, then generally I know that I'm leading with my values. If it's causing me distress, then I generally know that that's OCD. OCD is a shit show. Yes, OCD is a shit show. You are right, Caitlin. And you guys are welcome. So I also have some questions here from the community from earlier, and I'll go ahead and answer a couple of those since it looks like I'm going to have some time. Let's see. Okay, I'll go ahead and answer this one. I have a great therapist at the moment, but she doesn't do in-person ERP. I know that I need an in-person ERP. Virtual doesn't really work for me, but also don't want to stop seeing my current OCD therapist because she's awesome. Does anyone have advice on what you have found more important, Grace? Grace, I can answer this from a lived experience perspective. I can't necessarily tell you what you should do about your therapist or whether you should find another one or keep this one. I can say that I've done both virtual as well as in-person ERP. And I personally, for myself, find the in-person ERP to be more effective. I just feel like there is something about being in a situation in person, live, experiencing all that yucky, icky anxiety live in that moment that truly it just does something for me that the virtual experience cannot. I'm not saying virtual is bad. Virtual is great. And during the pandemic, I did only virtual for a long time. And it got me to the point where I could start doing live exposures again. So I think it's good to have both. But I do think that there's something to be said for in-person therapy. And it's okay to feel like you need that. And now I'm trying to move my little chat thingy and it's not moving. Where I live in Maine, they don't talk about harm, OCD, and scrupulosity. I reached out to my state representative and case manager and doctors, workers to educate themselves in my community. I'm bringing awareness. That's so awesome, Kate. That is amazing. And I know that the Faith and OCD Special Interest Group and their task force have been putting together a lot of resources to do exactly that, to reach out to churches and other organizations on a grassroots level to bring education and awareness about what OCD looks like, what scrupulosity looks like, and what that looks like when, people have it, so that they can get directed to the correct resources. And so I would encourage you definitely to look at that website, look at the resources they have there, and if you like, even reach out and get involved yourself, because it sounds like you're already doing an amazing job. 719, Captain Cass. Can virtual still be helpful if you like your current therapist? Yeah, absolutely. Virtual is great. I think virtual is such an amazing tool, and I did it for many years when I couldn't leave the house because I had agoraphobia. That's all I did, and it is super helpful. And I think a lot of people can do virtual and they don't need anything else. Just like anything else, OCD is a spectrum disorder, and it's not totally one size fits all. Something can be the gold standard therapy, but we can all have slightly different things that we need with it, right? Some of us may need ACT. Some of us may be able to do virtual and that's it. Some of us might need in-person therapy. So it's really about you and your preferences and what you find the most helpful. And if you find virtual helpful, then that's amazing. Let's see. A previous live stream answered the question about in-person versus virtual ERP. It was within the last month. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Abramowitz mentioned that the research coming out shows that virtual ERP is, I cannot see what that says, it is covered up by my chat button, is as effective as in person. Yes, and we always go by the research, right? Lived experience does not trump what the research says. Like I said, we try to look at things from a whole person perspective. So ERP, just like any other therapy, I believe should be tailored to the human being. So some people may prefer in person, some people may prefer virtual, some people may prefer a mix of both. And I think that that is okay, and that that is something that you should discuss with your therapist. 723, Janine. My fiance is in the middle of changing meds and his intrusive thoughts have become louder and harder to let be. It's making doing his therapy even more difficult. He has also temporarily stopped speaking to his therapist until he has settled into the new meds. He's really struggling. How can I help him? Okay, first of all, you are an amazing fiance for caring so much about your partner to come here and ask this question. I know that's super hard and super vulnerable, and you are just amazing. Thank you so much for being a good partner. I think if your fiance has temporarily stopped speaking to his therapist for whatever reason, that is obviously his choice. I can understand maybe where he's coming from, being a person with OCD myself, and feeling sometimes that when I'm struggling, I don't necessarily want to let other people in. I don't want them to, know that I'm having a hard time. I think you're doing the best thing you can do right now, which is looking for ways to support him, looking for ways to aid him in maybe reaching out for help without, trying to force him. I think just knowing that someone cares, I'm getting kind of emotional about it because honestly, it's just kind of an emotional thing for me. I'm sorry. But I think just knowing that someone cares that much, that they would come online and ask a stranger a question like that would make me feel so much better about myself and my OCD. If you are looking for specific tips on how to kind of navigate that with your partner, I know that there's an amazing book. I think it's called When a Loved One Has OCD. And there's also an article called The 25 Tips. Skyla, do you know the 25 tips? I think it's for children, but you can also utilize it for your partner. I'm going to see if I can pull it and put it in the chat. And Skyla's going to find the book for you as well. I think that the biggest thing with a partner that I've experienced in my own marriage is finding a way to be supportive and to even give assurance without giving reassurance. And I think that's a huge thing for us, is just knowing that someone's there, but they're not going to engage with the OCD. And they're still going to be there as a loving, kind, compassionate partner. And let's see here, 725, Leanne Richer. I am in a hoarding meeting at the moment covering all the, I can't see because this little chat button is in the way. Help me, Skyla. I don't know how to get rid of this little chat button. Covering all the bases, LOL. That's awesome. I do not have hoarding disorder. I have heard it is extremely difficult. So let's see. If you have any more questions, please put them in the chat. If not, I'll try to pull another one that hasn't already been answered from this document here. Let's see. Okay, I am going to answer this one. How do I find OCD resources in Spanish? My mom has OCD and it has been hard for her to engage in therapy because we need to find someone who speaks Spanish since she does not speak English. There are so many amazing resources in Spanish. Right off the top of my head, I can think of, if she's looking for, a book written by someone who has lived experience, who she can kind of resonate, which sometimes I think helps a lot with the stigma. There is a book called Tocada, and it is by the Argentinian singer Romina Vitale, and it is amazing. Yes, visit Tok Tok as well. They have an amazing website, as well as Tok Mexico. And I even think that there's a Spanish TLC BFRB branch for people who have BFRBs. And the IOCDF has also been working on getting more resources in Spanish. We have an annual conference, which just passed actually, for people who speak Spanish and have OCD and their loved ones, as well as professionals. Thank you, Skyla, you found it. And it was an amazing conference. It was super amazing. And there's lots of professionals speaking there about all kinds of different themes and all kinds of different topics surrounding OCD and related disorders. And it's such a wonderful community. I love the Latinx OCD community, to be honest. And I will also be launching a support group soon for Latinx people with OCD. And hopefully I will have one in English and one in Spanish, although I'm not quite as strong in my Spanish. And when I have that launched, I will be letting the community know. So there's lots of amazing resources. I think sometimes it's just a matter of finding them. Let's see. Maybe I can answer one more question. Let's see. Here's my questions. Sometimes I get confused with the difference between distracting myself and engaging in normal life activities once I have completed an exposure. How can I tell the difference? For instance, after I do an exposure, what do I do? Just sit there? Or can I go on the phone or call a friend? That's an interesting question. I think that when we are doing what we call intentional exposures, so whether you go to a doctor's office, your therapist, and you do the exposure along with your therapist, or you actually have a planned exposure that you're doing you're doing at home. I've learned from my therapist that it's a good idea to leave about 20 or 30 minutes after the exposure to actually process it. And so usually what I will do is I will sit down and write about how I felt before, during, and after the exposure. And so I will think about my anxiety levels and how they changed during and after, and any lessons that I may have learned during the exposure. And then I will send those to my therapist, and I like to keep a copy for myself too, so I can refer back to it. When we're doing what they call unplanned exposures, where we're just being exposed to things going on in our day to day lives, it's not reasonable to think that we may have 20 or 30 minutes after we run into a trigger, right? To just process the exposure. I mean, that would be weird, right? Like I walk into McDonald's and order food, and then I sit there for 20 or 30 minutes writing. Well, that might not be that weird, but I don't know. That might look a little strange. So, usually, what I like to do is I like to turn toward my values. So, if I've encountered something triggering to me, and I know that maybe something that I do is engage in avoidance by distracting myself, scrolling on my phone, or, possibly numbing out by eating or watching TV, I like to move toward my values instead. And that way I know that what I'm doing is intentionally engaging with something that is valuable or that I care about. And so that may look like going for a jog or reading a book or, playing with my son. So I think it's all about what do you value and what can you move towards instead of simply avoiding. And I think that's where you kind of find that answer, and it can vary for everyone. Thank you, Skyla. Skyla says we are also having a Spanish virtual BTTI in November for clinicians in Puerto Rico. And that is true and amazing. Thank you so much for that, IOCDF. You guys are amazing. 7:30, Caitlin Starr. I feel like when you have trauma and OCD comorbidity, it makes recovery a lot harder. I feel like when I am ordering and arranging, I am happier and calmer, but then deep down that I am just reinforcing my OCD. Yeah, that is so hard, and I resonate with that so much, right? I have those just right compulsions, and I I think I honestly, because it's not that feeling of like anxiety necessarily or total disgust, I felt like, well, if I just do this one thing, right? Like if I just go ahead and fix this, or if I go ahead and organize this entire pantry, or if I go ahead and, move all this furniture, I'm going to feel better and I'll be okay. And that's just, it's going to make me happy. But the thing is, it never did. It made me feel better for a little while. And then, just like you said, I reinforced those obsessions and I had to continue to do it. And the longer I reinforced my obsessions, the more stuff I had to do until one day I looked around and realized that I was compulsing around my house almost 24/7, locked in these just right compulsions and these contamination compulsions. And I think that just right is one of those that is kind of insidious because it feels like you're just doing something that's normal day to day life, but it's actually a ritual. And the more you do it, the more you reinforce that OCD cycle, the more you fall into its trap. I do think that the trauma and OCD comorbidity, in my experience, can make recovery harder. It doesn't mean it's not possible. It is. Um, I thought I would never get better. I thought that having trauma and having complex trauma would make it so that I could never manage my OCD. I went to therapy for OCD for a long time before anyone realized that I had all this trauma and that I needed to get separate therapy for it. And when I went to trauma therapy, I got extremely discouraged because I thought that, okay, here's my answer. I'm going to address my trauma, and now everything is going to be better. And I'll be able to manage my OCD, and I'll have all my trauma healed. And I'm going to feel like an amazing human being. And for a long time, for a couple of years, to be honest, every time I unpacked something in trauma, OCD would get triggered. And then I'd get my OCD under control and my trauma would come up to the surface. And it felt like I was on a seesaw. And little by little, what started happening is like those highs and lows just kind of evened out a little bit, and I'll still get them. But now I have the tools I need to regulate myself enough to get the OCD under control or to pull myself out of depression from trauma. I think it takes time. And sometimes I didn't even realize that it was working. And it really took a lot of commitment and trust and a lot of hard work. But it is possible. I don't want anyone to feel discouraged because it might feel harder. You can still recover from OCD and live an amazing, beautiful life and have trauma. And that's okay. You're still worthy of recovery and of putting in that hard work for yourself. And ERP does work even if you have trauma. Sometimes it takes extra time and extra work on your part. And that's okay. Rex Arellano Espinoza, Talk is OCD advocate community in Spanish. Yes, it is, and they are amazing. There are not very many legit resources for OCD in Spanish. I have combed through everything and made myself a spreadsheet as a researcher myself. I would love it if you could share that spreadsheet with us. We are always looking for more resources in Spanish. A lot of what talks about OCD in Spanish is not in line with the IOCDF and promotes antiquated, unproven ideas and therapy for OCD in Spanish. Yes, sometimes you can run across those, and that's not just for Spanish, that's for any community. And I think that's why it is so important and so awesome that we have the IOCDF, because I firsthand have knowledge of someone who has done ERP that was not really ERP, and how harmful that can be to a person with OCD. It's hard when you trust a therapist and you go somewhere, and you're looking for help with your disorder, and they try talk therapy or they try some form of therapy that is not specialized for OCD, and you're wondering why you're getting worse. That is certainly a problem in other countries, but it is not one that is just unique to the Latinx community. And that is exactly why I personally advocate, because I don't want anyone to go through what I went through. I don't want anyone to go to talk therapy and get worse. I don't want anyone to be turned off of therapy and stop seeking help because what they thought was going to help made them worse, or because their therapist told them that they were untreatable. And I think it's so important, especially in the Latinx community, to get the word out about what OCD really is and what the treatments are. Hi, Grace. It's so good to see you. "738 Caitlin Starr. I seeked an ERP therapist, but I feel like if they don't know how to treat the trauma at the same time, it is a hindrance in recovery. It is hard to find clinicians who have both. ERP literally makes me want to cry, and I get very frustrated and sad. It is hard to find someone who can treat both. I think it is important that more clinicians know about this comorbidity just from a lived experience perspective, and that more clinicians become trauma informed and learn how to do some trauma work. Caitlin, if you can, I have found relief in having an ERP therapist as well as a trauma therapist, and that, may be an option for some people who do not have, an ERP therapist who can treat trauma. It's called parallel treatment. It may or may not work for you. It has worked for me. I will say that ERP can be difficult when you have trauma triggers. And I think that no matter what, it's important to have a good foundation of trust and collaboration with your therapist, and to be open about what you're going through so that you can potentially build your exposures so that you are not getting into distress and becoming flooded. Because my therapist has taught me that being flooded is not helpful when you're trying to do exposure work. And I'm really sorry. I am really sorry that you are feeling that way. I know that's really hard. And I mean, it's honestly it's hard for me to talk about because it's something that I haven't been open about until recently, the trauma and OCD mix. And I think it's something that a lot of people don't always understand. Sonia Lloyd, 741. I had this terrible experience. The counselor claimed to have experience with OCD and trauma. I left feeling so much worse. I had severe anxiety afterwards. She wasn't trained. I felt tricked. It was really harmful. I'm so sorry. I think that that's so hard to be vulnerable with somebody and to feel like you can open up to them and trust them, and then have them be not the right person for you. And not only that, but to feel worse afterward. I think that that's just from experience. I know that's an awful thing to go through, and I'm really sorry that that happened to you. It can be really harmful, and that's why it's so important to raise awareness about OCD and how to treat it and the different comorbidities, including trauma. It's hard. And I know I've been through that where I thought someone was going to be able to treat me and they couldn't. And it just left me feeling kind of lost afterward. And I'm so glad that you're here with us. And hopefully you've gotten better help now. Meg Upton Summit at 742. 2 questions. Has anyone tried EMDR in combination with ERP and CBT? I do not have any experience with EMDR in combination with ERP and CBT. Meg, are you asking in relation to treating trauma, or are you asking in relation to treating OCD? And while I wait for Meg, I will answer Grace's question at 743. What is advice that people have in regards to opening up to people about their OCD diagnosis? We talked about this in my OCD group yesterday and found that a lot of people have different experiences with telling family, friends, coworkers about their OCD. Grace, this is such an amazing question. I have found that this is something where your mileage really may vary in regards to opening up about your diagnosis. I found it really hard for a long time to open up about OCD. And honestly, when I started advocating, I was kind of private about it. My family didn't know. A lot of my friends didn't know. I had had the experience of opening up at work and being sort of stigmatized by being told, well, we're all a little bit OCD and it probably makes you better at your job. I think that it's such a highly individual thing. And something that I like to ask myself is, if I open up about my diagnosis to this person, what is it going to add to my life? Is it going to deepen the relationship with them? Is that something that I want? Do I feel ready to, answer their questions? Do I feel ready to help them become educated? Or is this something that is potentially going to, harm me in a way? And for me, I think that that's been helpful in knowing who to disclose to. I think disclosing is a very, very personal thing. And, it's not something that we should feel pressured to do. But if you think it will bring good into your life, then I think it can be a wonderful thing. My parents were not super accepting at first, but they are more accepting now. And I think it's helped our relationship. My partner is accepting, and it's definitely helped our relationship. It worked not so much, but that's okay. So, I think it's kind of up to you. Let's see. Okay, Meg's answered at 7:44. I have a history of trauma also, and my therapist suggested I try EMDR, but she is not an OCD specialist. I have heard that people have had success with EMDR. I've heard it can be really great when it works. It is an evidence-based practice for trauma, but it is not for all trauma. So I would say that that is something that you want to discuss with your therapist and make sure that, they are specialized in EMDR and that they are, at least communicating with your OCD therapist about what's going on in therapy so that you can, calibrate both therapies. Meg Upton, does anyone have compulsive eating? How do I know if my eating is related to my OCD or something else? That's such an amazing question. I know that sometimes I in the past have an eating disorder. I have bulimia and I am in recovery for it. And I sometimes catch myself falling into kind of those eating disorder behaviors where I'll compulsively eat, or I'll eat to numb my feelings, or I'll feel that urge to binge. And I generally know when it's kind of compulsion related if I'm eating in response to anxiety or some kind of bad feeling, like a yucky feeling, or if I'm feeling shame and guilt around my eating. So if I feel like I need to hide, or if I feel bad about it while I am not enjoying my meal, I am not enjoying my snack, then I generally know that that is compulsive eating. And I don't think it necessarily has to be a full on eating disorder, right, to be compulsive eating. And that's a great question to bring to your therapist. $7.44. I tried to do that, and one of my old therapists told me that seeing two therapists at once is not clinically ethical in the psychology world. And I believe you need to see two therapists at once to get your specialist. I am not aware of that being unethical. I've actually heard of it as a valid form of treatment, but I would definitely be interested in knowing if that's unethical. I do believe that sometimes people who have multiple disorders, just like someone who has multiple medical conditions, would need to see two people who have different specialties. I certainly wouldn't want my heart doctor treating my diabetes and vice versa. I think that it's important that we as patients get our needs met, and I can't necessarily expect, although I wish I could, my OCD specialist to be able to treat my trauma. Lots of questions about sort of disclosing. Let's see here. Grace, off because I don't mention it. I think that when we talk about disclosing or stigma in other, ethnicities or races or even countries, there are a lot of different barriers, right? To getting people to understand and to getting people to accept us as who we are. And I, for one, feel like I do a lot of masking, to borrow a term from the autistic community, where I try to present myself as normal. I don't want people to see my compulsions. I don't want them to, judge me for my mental health condition, because I know that there's a stigma and I carry that stigma. And I know that they might see me differently if I disclose that I have a mental health condition. I carry the extra burden of being Latina and feeling like I'm not allowed to be mentally ill in my family. And that when people find out I'm mentally ill, they shun me or they push me away, or they think that I'm just sick in the head, as, something that they say, and they judge me for getting treatment. And it is very difficult to overcome all of those things. And it's very real. And I think that it's something that we all have to individually weigh. You know, is disclosing going to make my life better, or is it going to make my life worse? And no one can really answer that except us. I have been in that situation where I feel like I need to explain away certain behaviors, where people are like, what are you doing? Why are you so scared of this? Why do you not want to go get on this zip line thingy? Why are you freaking out about it? Or why are you freaking out about a needle? And it's like, I don't know how to explain to you without telling you, like, my mental health diagnoses, that I have these extra fears, or I have these weird irrational behaviors. And it's hard. It's hard to be different and have a different brain in a world that is not necessarily always very accepting of it. And I think that I don't have like the best answer for that, except finding community with people who are like you or like us, where, it can be a relief to drop that mask and find people who are like us, who understand. And, sometimes I think as relationships form and deepen, it can really help to start slowly disclosing and kind of teaching people about what OCD is and how it presents. But it's just so hard, I think, sometimes to overcome those barriers. And I wish I had all the answers. I don't. All I can say is that I am in that boat with you, and I know it's tough, and you're all a bunch of badasses for dealing with it. And yes, I did. I did host a live stream in March about culture and OCD. Let's see. Sonia Lloyd, do you know how much OCD can be related to PANS? I think it's called strep throat. So I am not very familiar with PANS, and I feel like I really should be, because I know that it is a related disorder, and I am aware that sometimes it can develop after a child has had strep throat. I think I don't know. I know that we have a whole section on PANS on our website on the IOCDF, and I want to speak to it, but I cannot because I'm not familiar with it. So I am going to leave it to Skyla to put that link in the chat. 754 Meg Upton Summit. I have a third question, which is about terminology. What do people prefer as a label? Mentally ill, mentally disabled? Is there a term that doesn't sound so bad? You're welcome, Sonia. Gosh, that's a good question, and I've wrestled with that question myself. When I first started my advocacy journey, I really disliked the term mental illness and mentally ill, and I preferred the term mental health disorder. As I've kind of gotten further in my journey, I find that mental illness doesn't bother me so much. I think it varies, depending on the community you're in and who you speak to. Some people prefer to be called neurodivergent or neurodiverse. I really think it's up to the individual as to how they want to quote unquote label themselves. I don't mind being called mentally ill unless it's a insult. I don't mind being called, somebody with a mental health disorder, again, as long as it's not an insult. Unfortunately, in our society, people have used those terms as insults. And so I think it does make it sound bad when it shouldn't necessarily be bad, if that makes sense. And I would love a new word that isn't so bad, but I think unfortunately, until the discourse around mental illness has changed, whatever we come up with is going to be weaponized, if that makes sense. Nikki Bretley, I always say that I have mental health issues. Yeah, and that's something you can say. It's up to the individual. I typically just say that I have OCD, and then I am prepared for the conversation that happens afterward. But that, is not for everybody. Rachel Fry, I personally prefer neurodivergent. I struggle with OCD, ADHD, depression, and ED. Yeah, I like neurodivergent as well. I am aware that there is some, disagreement about who is, supposed to be able to use the term neurodivergent. So I, try not to use it all the time. But I do like the term, and it's one that I would prefer personally. We have a couple of minutes if you guys have any other questions. 7:56, so does the IOCDF have any plans to remedy this problem? I personally do not feel like the IOCDF has any advocate who represents the Latinx OCD experience across the board. Why are there not a more diverse set of IOCDF advocates? I am Latinx. I am aware that I do not represent all Latinx people, unfortunately. We are an extremely heterogeneous group. And, our customs, language, and, just experiences can vary greatly. A Latinx who's living stateside can vary greatly from a Latinx living in their country of origin or in a different country. A Latinx who is first generation, like myself, is going to be different from second or third generation. I think that the IOCDF does an amazing job of reaching out and, including a diverse set of people. I think that there are a lot of issues still with stigma and cultural barriers where people feel they cannot speak out or they do not want to speak out. It makes it harder for them. And we are always, always, always looking for and welcoming of anyone who would like to speak to their experience as a Latinx with OCD. Absolutely. Okay, guys, we have 1 minute. So if we did not get to your questions, I am so, so sorry. Please feel free to leave them in the chat and we will try to grab them, or you can email them. Skyla, would you put the email in the chat for those who had questions and they didn't get answered? And I am going to very quickly read the announcements, y'all. You had some amazing, amazing questions. You kept me super busy and on my toes. Announcements tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern. Join advocates Liz Mackingvale and Chris Tronston for this month's Lunch and Learn on Anxiety in the Classroom. They will be joined by Susan Boaz and Denise Egan Stack. You can submit questions ahead of time on social media at IOCDF or online at iocdf.org/peace of mind. There are more walks happening this October for the 1 Million Steps for OCD Walk. Visit iocdf.org/walk to find a walk happening near you and join us as we embrace uncertainty one step at a time. Registration for the online OCD conference November 4th through 6th is now open. Visit onlineocdconference.org to learn more and register. This live stream is one of many. You can see the entire schedule of future streams at iocdf.org/peace of mind. You can also view recordings of past live streams on IOCDF's YouTube channel, youtube.com/IOCDF. Remember to like and subscribe to get notified when live streams are scheduled. If you need resources, please visit iocdf.org. Thank you so much, guys. Have an amazing evening.